There is a tension that lives in all of us, the tension between what we want to happen and when we want it to happen. We make plans, set deadlines, and live by calendars, yet often find ourselves frustrated when life refuses to follow our schedule. It's as if we are racing against time, trying to control it, harness it, and shape it to fit our desires. But life teaches us, time and again, that there is a rhythm far greater than our own, something beyond clocks and calendars, a timing that does not always align with our impatience, our hopes, or even our prayers. This timing, often called God's timing, invites us to slow down and trust in a divine orchestration far more intricate than we can imagine. We want answers immediately. But the truth is, sometimes the greatest blessings come in delays. It's painful, frustrating even, to wait for what seems so obvious, so necessary. Yet there is a hidden wisdom in waiting that we often miss. Waiting is not wasted time. It is not empty. It is fertile ground. Seeds planted in waiting seasons often grow into the strongest roots, the tallest trees. When we rush ahead, we risk missing the preparation we need for what is to come. God's timing is never about inconvenience or punishment. It is about perfect preparation. There is a sacredness in this delay that teaches patience, shapes character, and aligns us with a greater purpose. Have you ever looked back on your life and realized that something you once begged for too soon actually arrived too late? That's the mystery of timing. What we desire in a moment may not be what we truly need at that time. Sometimes God's no or not yet is a profound yes to a better plan. Imagine a gardener who waits until the soil is just right, the season is perfect, and the plant is ready to flourish before planting the seed. That gardener is wise, intentional, and loving. In the same way, God watches over our lives, waiting for the perfect moment, when conditions are right, when our hearts are ready, when the timing will produce the best fruit. Trusting that timing is an act of faith. We often forget that time itself is a created thing. It is not infinite, and it is not chaotic. It is ordered, purposeful, and in its deepest sense, under divine control. Our impatience arises from living in a limited view, focused on the immediate, the urgent, the visible. But there is a larger story unfolding, one in which every moment has meaning, even the ones that feel like delays. God's timing is about more than punctuality. It is about destiny, about the right people, the right circumstances, the right opportunities coming together. When we step back and see life from this broader perspective, we learn to release our grip on the clock and rest in the assurance that nothing is random or wasted. It's difficult to accept when plans are postponed, dreams are delayed, or prayers seem unanswered. We want life to fit our vision, but often life is teaching us to fit into a larger vision. That is the heart of trusting God's timing, realizing that His plan may be unfolding slowly, but it is always unfolding wisely. Sometimes we push against the delay, trying to force outcomes or take shortcuts. But rushing usually leads to broken things, broken promises, broken relationships, broken hearts. Learning to wait well is learning to trust that what we cannot see is being worked out by a loving hand. The delay is not denial. It is preparation. It is growth. It is grace. When God's timing feels late, it's easy to grow weary and discouraged. Doubts creep in, questions multiply. Why is this taking so long? Does God even hear me? Have I missed my chance? These questions are natural, but they do not have to define our journey. Instead, they can lead us deeper into trust. Trust is not the absence of questions, but the choice to hope anyway, to believe that what seems late to us is right on time in the grand story. The moments when you feel most stretched and waiting longest may be exactly when your faith is being strengthened the most. These are not empty pauses. They are the crucibles where patience, hope, and resilience are born. Our timing is often impatient and impulsive. driven by fear or desire. God's timing is patient and perfect, rooted in infinite wisdom and love. The difference between these two timings can feel like a chasm, but it is in that gap that faith is formed. When we learn to rest in that space, something miraculous happens. We grow less frantic and more faithful. We move from controlling to surrendering. The surrender is not defeat, it is freedom. Freedom from the pressure to have everything figured out. Freedom to trust a higher plan that we cannot yet see. This freedom allows us to live fully in the present moment, even as we hope for the future. History is full of stories where God's timing surprised everyone. People who waited years for a breakthrough, only to find that the wait was exactly what was needed. Consider those who have waited for healing, for reconciliation, for opportunities. Their stories are often not about instant miracles, but about gradual transformation. The wait shaped their character, deepened their faith, and prepared them for what was next. Waiting well is a spiritual discipline, a practice that cultivates patience, strengthens hope, and shapes character. It is in these quiet moments, between the not yet and the finally, that life's most profound lessons are learned. Sometimes we mistake God's timing for his absence. When we don't see immediate results, it's tempting to think that he has forgotten us. But absence and timing are not the same. Silence is not absence. It's often the space where God is working most powerfully, though unseen. Think of the seed buried in the dark soil. It is silent and invisible, but beneath the surface, life is growing. The same is true for us. In seasons of waiting, God is not idle. He is preparing, protecting, and perfecting what is to come. Our challenge is to trust in what cannot yet be seen, and to believe that God's timing is good, even when it is mysterious. There is a peace that comes from surrendering our timelines to God's plan. This peace doesn't erase the longing or the waiting, but changes our perspective. It allows us to see that timing is not just about what happens, but when it happens. It's about the journey, not just the destination. When we embrace God's timing, we discover that the waiting season is itself a gift, a time of growth, preparation, and revelation. We learn to listen, to rest, to hope, and to trust in the divine orchestration of our lives. And in that trust, we find a calm that transcends circumstances, a steady assurance that God's timing is always perfect. In our fast-paced world, waiting feels unnatural. We want immediate answers, instant gratification, and quick fixes. But the spiritual life often calls us to slow down, to trust a pace beyond our control. This waiting isn't passive, it's active. It means staying present in the moment, choosing faith over frustration, and finding purpose in the pause. Waiting well means learning to be still and know that life unfolds in seasons. Just like a tree takes time to bear fruit, our dreams and prayers need time to mature. This doesn't mean giving up or losing hope. It means embracing the journey, trusting that God is weaving together all the pieces in the right moment. Our timing can be impatient and short-sighted, but God's timing is patient and perfect. Sometimes God's timing clashes with our plans because what we want is not what we need. It's hard to accept that what feels like delay might actually be protection. Perhaps a door we long to open isn't yet ready because the path beyond holds lessons we are prepared for. When we trust God's timing, we accept that He sees the whole picture while we see only a fragment. It's like reading a book in the middle and wondering why the story doesn't make sense. But if we keep reading, the pieces come together beautifully. God's timing is a part of His greatest story for our lives. And when we surrender our timing, we allow that story to unfold with wisdom and grace. Patience is often misunderstood as passive waiting, but it is one of the most powerful expressions of faith. When we are patient, we are not merely enduring time, we are partnering with God's process. Patience means believing that God's timing is good, even when it's hard to see. It means saying, "Not my will, but yours," to our inner clock, and releasing control. This can be incredibly difficult, especially when the stakes feel high or the waiting drags on. But patience creates space for growth of character, understanding, and trust. It transforms waiting from frustration into a sacred discipline. Through patience, we become more attuned to God's voice and more open to His timing. One of the greatest challenges of trusting God's timing is the tension between hope and uncertainty. Hope holds us steady in the unknown, while uncertainty can make us anxious or fearful. But hope rooted in God's timing is different from mere wishful thinking. It is a confident expectation that even if we cannot see the end, God is working all things for good. This hope sustains us through delays and disappointments and teaches us to hold lightly to our plans and tightly to our faith. When we embrace God's timing, we learn that uncertainty is not something to fear, but a space where miracles can happen. Waiting in hope keeps our hearts open and our spirits alive. Our own timing is often driven by fear of missing out, fear of failure, or fear that our prayers won't be answered. But God's timing is rooted in love, and love is never rushed. It takes the time needed to nurture, to heal, and to prepare. When we release our fear and surrender to God's timing, we step into a rhythm of trust that transforms us. Instead of grasping desperately for control, we rest in the assurance that God's plans are always for our good. This trust isn't easy, but it is freeing. It allows us to live with peace, even when the road ahead is uncertain. Trusting God's timing invites us to live not by the clock, but by faith. There is a divine logic to God's timing that often defies our human understanding. It reminds me of the way the seasons change, sometimes suddenly, sometimes gradually, but always in their perfect order. We cannot speed up the arrival of spring or prolong the harvest. Similarly, our lives have seasons that come and go according to God's perfect plan. Some seasons are times of growth, others of rest, and some of challenge. Each has its purpose, and trusting God's timing means recognizing the value in every season. When we try to force things ahead of their time, we risk damaging the growth that God is nurturing inside us. Learning to honor the seasons of life is part of trusting His perfect timing. The stories of those who have trusted God's timing often reveal a pattern, moments of waiting, followed by moments of breakthrough. This pattern is not random but intentional. Waiting prepares the heart and mind for what is to come. It builds resilience, sharpens discernment, and deepens faith. When the breakthrough finally comes, it is sweeter and more meaningful because of the waiting. Without the struggle, the triumph loses its power. Without the delay, the answer loses its depth. So the next time you feel frustrated by waiting, remember that it is part of a sacred rhythm designed to shape you into the person you need to be for the blessings ahead. God's timing also reminds us that we are not in control, and that's a good thing. Control often leads to anxiety and frustration because it is an impossible burden to carry. Trusting God's timing means letting go of that burden and acknowledging that a higher power is guiding the course of our lives. This surrender doesn't mean we stop dreaming or working toward our goals. It is the difference between gripping tightly and holding loosely. When we hold loosely, we allow God's timing to lead us to places we might never have imagined. There is a profound peace that comes when we finally accept that God's timing is better than ours. This acceptance is not resignation, but liberation. It frees us from the chains of impatience and frustration. It invites us to rest in the knowledge that everything is unfolding according to a divine plan that we can trust. This peace doesn't remove the challenges or the waiting, but transforms our experience of them. Instead of anxiety, we feel calm. Instead of despair, we feel hope. Instead of confusion, we feel clarity. Trusting God's timing reshapes how we live each moment, helping us to find joy even in the waiting. One way to cultivate trust in God's timing is to reflect on the past and recognize the moments when what seemed like delays were actually blessings in disguise. Perhaps a job opportunity didn't come through, only to make room for something better. Maybe a relationship ended prematurely, opening the door for healing and growth. Looking back, we often see that God's timing was perfect, even when it felt painful in the moment. This retrospective gratitude helps build confidence in God's timing moving forward. It teaches us that, even when the now is difficult, the future holds promise. Trust is strengthened when we remember that God has never been late before. Another challenge in trusting God's timing is balancing action and patience. Sometimes we wonder if we should wait quietly or take bold steps forward. The truth is, trusting God's timing doesn't mean passivity. It means moving with discernment, guided by faith and wisdom. It means listening deeply for God's direction and acting when the time is right. This dance between waiting and acting requires sensitivity to the Spirit and courage to trust. Sometimes action will lead to new opportunities. Sometimes waiting will prepare us for what's next. Learning when to act and when to wait is a vital part of growing in faith and trusting God's perfect timing. In the moments when God's timing feels slowest, it's important to remember that God's clock is not broken. It never runs behind or ahead. It is perfect, just beyond our understanding. This perspective calls us to patience and perseverance. It also invites us to embrace the present moment fully, trusting that it is exactly where we need to be. We can choose to see waiting as an opportunity for growth, reflection, and rest. By doing so, we align ourselves with God's rhythm and open our hearts to receive His blessings in their fullness and timing. Our human timelines are often driven by fear and urgency, but God's timing is rooted in love and purpose. Love is patient, it waits without frustration. Purpose is precise, it unfolds according to plan. When we trust God's timing, we align ourselves with that love and purpose. This alignment brings clarity, peace, and direction. It helps us to stop fighting against the current and instead float with the river of life God has set before us. It frees us from anxiety about what should have happened and opens us to the joy of what is happening now. The tension between God's timing and our timing can be a powerful teacher. It teaches us humility, reminding us that we don't have all the answers. It teaches us faith, encouraging us to believe in the unseen. It teaches us hope, helping us to look beyond immediate frustrations to a future filled with promise. In this tension, we learn to lean into God's love and wisdom rather than our own understanding. We learn that sometimes the best thing we can do is wait, actively, patiently, and faithfully, trusting that God's timing is always perfect. Finally, trusting God's timing invites us to live with open hands and open hearts. It challenges us to release control, surrender our plans, and embrace the mystery of life. It calls us to patience when we want to rush, to hope when we feel despair, and to trust when we feel doubt. This trust is not easy, but it is transformative. It changes how we see ourselves, our lives, and our God. It allows us to live with peace in the waiting and joy in the journey. Ultimately, trusting God's timing is trusting God Himself, a trust that sustains us through every season and leads us into a future filled with hope. In moments of waiting, the heart can grow restless. We tend to fill silence with noise and impatience. Yet, it is often in the quiet moments that God's timing becomes clearest. The silence is an invitation, not a punishment, to listen deeply and reflect. Waiting is not the absence of movement, but a subtle, behind-the-scenes work that shapes our character and aligns our desires with what is truly best. This invisible work may be confusing or discouraging, but it is essential. Like the invisible roots of a tree growing deep underground, the work happening in the waiting prepares us for the fullness of life we have yet to see. Sometimes we ask for signs or clear answers to guide us through the waiting. But God's timing often involves mystery, requiring us to step forward in faith, even when the path is unclear. Faith is the bridge between what we want now and what God has planned for later. It doesn't depend on certainty, but on trust. We learn to walk by faith, not by sight, trusting that every delay is purposeful and that every moment is part of a divine timeline beyond our understanding. This trust frees us to keep moving forward with hope, even in uncertainty. Many people feel pressure to compare their timing with others, seeing friends or peers move ahead faster in careers, relationships, or other milestones. This comparison can breed frustration and doubt, making us question if we've been forgotten or left behind. But God's timing is unique for each person. It is tailored perfectly to our own journey. Just because someone else's season arrives sooner does not mean we are late. Comparing our timeline to another's is like comparing apples to oranges. Each fruit ripens in its own time and place. Trusting God's timing means embracing your unique path without envy or despair. Trusting God's timing is also about learning to recognize when it's time to act. Waiting doesn't mean passivity or inaction. It means being attentive to the moment when God opens the door. Sometimes the wait is broken by an unexpected opportunity, a sudden insight, or a gentle prompting. Discerning this moment requires patience, prayer, and a heart attuned to God's voice. When the right moment comes, faith calls us to step forward with courage, knowing that we are aligned with the divine plan. The balance between waiting and acting is delicate but essential in walking faithfully in God's timing. A helpful way to think about God's timing versus our timing is to imagine a symphony orchestra. Each musician plays their part at exactly the right moment. The conductor doesn't rush or delay. Instead, every note is played in perfect harmony with the others. If one musician plays too early or too late, the music loses its beauty. Similarly, God is the conductor of our lives, coordinating every event and season in perfect timing. When we try to play our part too soon or too late, we create dissonance. Trusting God's timing allows us to play our part beautifully in the grand symphony of life. When things don't happen according to our timing, we might feel tempted to try harder, push more, or control outcomes. But often, this only leads to burnout and frustration. God's timing invites us to release the pressure to force things to happen. It teaches us to work diligently, but also to rest confidently, knowing that some things are beyond our control. This balance between effort and surrender is a hallmark of spiritual maturity. It reflects the deep trust that God is working all things together for good, even when we cannot see the full picture. Sometimes the waiting season feels like a test of faith. We wonder if we will ever receive what we long for. But these tests are opportunities for growth. They refine our character, deepen our understanding, and strengthen our resilience. Just as gold is purified by fire, so our faith is strengthened by waiting. The wait teaches us to trust not just in the outcome, but in God Himself, but shifts our focus from what we want to who God is. This shift is transformative, leading us to a deeper relationship with God. Grounded not in circumstances, but in love and faithfulness. Our culture often equates success with speed, the faster the better. Yet some of the most beautiful and lasting things in life take time. Friendships, wisdom, healing, and spiritual growth all require patience. God's timing reminds us that what is lasting is worth waiting for. When we rush, we risk losing the depth and richness that come from time. Waiting cultivates endurance, appreciation, and gratitude. It helps us savor the journey rather than just longing for the destination. Trusting God's timing is a countercultural practice, calling us to slow down and embrace the fullness of life in every moment. At times, waiting feels lonely. It can seem like everyone else is moving forward while we remain stuck. But God's timing is never about isolation. Even in the quietest moments, God is present, working on our behalf. The waiting season can become a time of intimate connection with God, where we learn to listen more closely and depend more fully. It's a season of spiritual growth that prepares us for the next chapter. When God feels silent, it's often because he is preparing something great, something that requires patience and trust on our part. Trusting God's timing also requires humility. It means acknowledging that we don't have all the answers and that our understanding is limited. This humility opens the door to wisdom. It helps us accept that delays or detours might be part of a greater plan we cannot yet see. Humility softens our hearts and makes us receptive to God's guidance. It helps us surrender our desires and agendas, inviting us to walk gently with patience and hope. When we embrace humility, we discover that trusting God's timing becomes less about control and more about grace. It is important to remember that God's timing is never arbitrary, it is purposeful and precise. Every delay, every season of waiting is woven into the fabric of our lives for a reason. Sometimes the reason is clear, other times it remains a mystery. But we can trust that God's timing is always for our good and his glory. This trust brings peace in the present and hope for the future. It reassures us that even when life feels uncertain or delayed, God is faithfully orchestrating every detail. The tension between God's timing and our timing invites us to cultivate a deep inner peace. This peace is not dependent on circumstances, but flows from trust in God's faithfulness. It helps us endure waiting without bitterness or anxiety. When we live in this peace, we are able to face delays and disappointments with grace. We become a witness to others, showing that faith is not about having all the answers, but about trusting in God's perfect plan. This peace transforms our perspective and empowers us to live with hope, joy, and patience. Trusting God's timing also means embracing the unknown. It requires courage to step into uncertainty without knowing how things will unfold. But this courage is strengthened by faith. When we trust God's timing, we take steps forward with confidence, knowing that we are guided by a loving hand. This trust frees us from the fear of what might go wrong and opens us to the possibilities of what God can do. The unknown becomes an adventure rather than a source of anxiety. Trusting God's timing invites us to live boldly in faith. Sometimes God's timing involves waiting for healing, physical, emotional, or spiritual. Healing is rarely instant. It is often a process. During this process, patience is essential. We learn to care for ourselves, seek support, and trust that healing is happening even when it's not visible. God's timing for healing is always perfect, even if it doesn't match our expectations. Trusting this timing helps us find peace amid pain and hope amid struggle. It reminds us that healing is a journey and God is with us every step of the way. The story of God's timing is one of redemption. It teaches us that delays and waiting are not setbacks, but part of a larger story of hope and restoration. Every season of waiting holds the potential for transformation. When we trust God's timing, we open ourselves to the possibility that what feels like a delay is actually a setup for a greater blessing. This perspective transforms waiting from frustration into anticipation. It fills our hearts with expectation and our minds with hope. Trusting God's timing is ultimately trusting in a God who redeems all things and makes all things new.